Can everyone see okay? Everything's good in regards to like seeing the all good, okay. I don't understand how every week there's something else like this doesn't work. It's typical. How's everyone doing? Is everyone okay with the course? Like, does the majority of you are in the chat room now or in the room? Just how is everyone doing? It's insane to think that the semester's already over. To be honest, I felt like we've had a lot that when this course is in person, it runs a lot smoother than it has, and I think of no fault of your own. We and I guess myself, we just had to change the labs around. So I wanted to confirm that you guys are all okay. Just to reiterate that there is the 2 quizzes that are due before the final exam. And there's just the questions, like sample questions that you go in and out, and then just if to answer them. They're going to be covering lectures 7 and 8, and then 9 and 10. We have the assignment that's going to be due the last day of classes. The rubric is all laid out. There's a presentation as well that will detail the specific components. And so as long as you go through and sort of answer all of the questions from the rubric, you should get a really high mark. The averages have always been really good. Remember that the exam is cumulative, so that you have to go over the stuff from the first half again, and then there's the 4 lectures from the second half, so the motor learning component. I'm going to send out a breakdown of the questions per lecture again. Beck wants to know how my foot is, and guess what I did? I've decided that I'm an anti-caster. I feel as though castes infringe on my rights as both a citizen of Canada and a human being, and I want to see the evidence that shows castes help. Just kidding. I took an X-ray and we're good. Did you? I'm Chris Sky. I don't know if you guys know like the memes. A cast for both feet. For your motor control assignment, you should do how to like walk with 2 casts. But no, I believe in casts. I got an X-ray and it just confirmed that the heel was, or the break was healed. So I took the cast off. I'm just trying to okay. Sorry to hear that, Vic. See, this would be good for us if we were like sort of in person to sort of develop a back and forth. But I know that we relate all of this information to sports settings because it's something that I don't know, maybe me, but it's something we're all sort of familiar with. But think about this from also as equally a rehabilitation perspective. So you have to retrain people how to do motor skills that they used to do following an injury or a neurological injury. They have to relearn sort of how to use, like neuromuscularly, how to use their bodies, not just relearn a new way to do their movements. In today's lecture, what we're going to be doing is talking about the best ways to adjust your practice to maximize learning. And so the breakdown of the lecture today is in 2 components. It doesn't take too long, to be honest. It probably will take us about an hour to get through all the material. So I just wanted to make sure that I go slowly and make sure that I give you guys time to just to go over a lot of the stuff from the course. And if you had any questions, we're going to be talking about practice variability. We're going to be talking about how to organize variability within practice and the limits of contextual interference, which is sort of a term we're going to learn. Then we're going to talk about practice specificity and discuss the amount of practice that's necessary, how you should distribute your practice, and then how long you should wait in between practice trials in the same practice session. Okay? And so the question to start off this lecture is what I want to pose to you guys is think about different sports and rehabilitation settings, any training situations, any situations where you yourself have had to teach, a large number of people. What would you say is the most effective strategies to run a practice? So here's some examples. Think about soccer or hockey, or what about Here we have someone walking on one of those Locomat machines to relearn how to walk after a spinal cord injury. What are some of the factors or things that you would want to sort of like consider when trying to like effectively create some sort of like practice schedule? What are some things that are typically things to consider? So anything that really comes off the top of your head. Yep, exactly. Yeah, I think so. Those are really great examples. Current skill level, exactly. So with Ryuta was saying, like accommodation time, consistency. So really, like a lot of the time now, like you have gym space, or like there's only a set number of time. Like let's say you only have 2 1-hour sessions a week for 4 weeks, or think of like summer camps, or like training in the gym, even like booking appointments at a hospital. There's like always a set number of time. So the limitation is that you can't just spend as much time as you can with these people, depending on the population that you're treating or working with. There's always there's always a limitation of space and time. And so what you want to do is you want to try to maximize the amount of time that you have. Um, Marco talked about how it's important to make it fun and cooperative, and that's true. I think the most important thing that we've learned in terms of motor learning is the whole cognitive component. And so if you don't keep people engaged or they lose motivation, they're not going to be focusing on what they're doing. And then research has shown us that that leads to poor learning. And then Ryan suggested considering the current skill level, and that's absolutely true, right? You want to make sure that you are wanting to maximize the time by teaching at the current level that they're at. So that way, we've learned that the best way to teach is a stepwise formation, right? The whole thing about Gentile's taxonomy originally, you want to go step by step. The whole idea of positive transfer of learning. You want to um, build on the learning to foster better motor learning. So these are all great examples, and these are what to consider. So one thing that we haven't discussed yet specifically is talking about practice variability. Now, we do know that practice variability or variations of movement lead to better learning. Now, we've talked about this generally throughout the course or through the second half of the course, that increased variation is important for learning, specifically for open motor skills, but variability leads to a better consolidation. So whether it's the memory, whether it's like putting out the motor program to do the motor skill that the people are doing, but variability leads to better performance, better learning, and therefore better performance. So therefore, the question is like, what do you vary? Like, what movements? How do you optimize variability? Like, what are sort of the characteristics or sort of factors that you should consider when you want to vary the movements in practice to allow for increased learning? So the concept, just to throw it out there, is that the variability of practice experiences is important for motor learning, and that's something we can all agree with. Ryan, Marco, Ryuta, do you all agree with me? Because you're like, you think about it. Like I had a class. Let me pose this question to you: does it make sense that by learning variations of the movement, it allows you to have a greater, memory consolidation of the motor skill, and therefore you can perform it better under a wide range of conditions, right? Because remember when we talked about, motor performance, as you get better and better in terms of motor learning, you become able to do that motor skill under a wide range of varying, regulatory conditions. And so, therefore, if you introduce that in practice, it may lead to poor performance during practice, but ultimately leads to better learning. So let's talk about the studies that have sort of shown that. So the term itself, practice variability, specifically refers to the variety of movement and context characteristics that the learner experiences while practicing a skill. So this is the variations of both the movements and the context, the context of the motor skill that the learner will experience as they're practicing. So therefore, the question is, what movement and context characteristics can be varied in practice? So you could vary the physical context in which the skill is performed. So you could change regulatory and non-regulatory conditions in the environment, right? You can alter those things. Or you can alter the movement required in test conditions. So ultimately, if you change regulatory conditions, alter the movement, right? You have to adjust your movement for those conditions. So changing regulatory conditions ultimately changes your movements. But what about if we introduced movement variability into practice? Like, for example, we're going to talk about learning how to do a basketball shot. Is it better to just learn how to shoot from one spot on the court, or is it better to practice shooting from all areas? Free throw, in the key, layups, 3-point line, corner, elbow. What would you think, guys? Yeah, all of them. And so research has shown that. It shows that increased um, variability leads to an increased positive transfer. And this variability, they suggest, can be related to an increase in performance error while practicing. So if you introduce variability, ultimately what you do is you introduce more error into the practice, right? So that was why this research had to be done, because if you are practicing variations of the skill, your performance is going to be less, you know, your performance will be less during practice, but it ultimately leads to better learning. And so that was the concept that people had to sort of wrap their head around. And so there was a bunch of research that sort of tried to prove that. Here, we look at an example of a study that was comparing whether or not variable practice led to an improved ability to learn basketball free throws. Now, let me pose a question to you again, guys. Why would introducing more variability and ultimately performance errors lead to better motor learning? Yeah. So by different outcomes, Kristen, what do you mean? Like outcomes, like measures, or? Yeah, I think I was waiting for Kristen to reply, but Apollo's right too. By introducing the different scenarios that you're probably going to see in, like, in this case, it's free throws. So um, the, by introducing different variations of the movement pattern that you're going to see in the sport you're practicing or whatever skill you're practicing, you're ultimately going to have a better understanding of how to work with errors, understand your body, be able to pull all that stuff together and put it into an action plan. Oh, Kristen's answered. I guess measures so it can help with adapting and knowing different outcomes through different variations of actions. Um, so would that be from the perspective of the learner or from the person that's teaching them? So I guess I think you're right. I think I follow on with what you're saying, Kristen, that they are going to look at, the outcome of their movements in whatever skill they're doing, the outcome in different areas. And so they're going to understand how to perform during the different variations. I think I follow on with you. And I think what you're saying the same thing is, in a sense, what Jordan is saying. And with what Apollo is saying as well. Yeah, that makes sense. I think you're right. I don't think that these concepts specifically are difficult to sort of understand. I think that, if anything, this kind of stuff is what sort of helps us better understand how the mind sort of processes and works. Because in this study, so what they did was they were comparing variable versus constant practice. And so they had a bunch of different groups. So they had groups that would practice, let's see, variable practice group. So this was the variable practice group was C, variable front and back, VC. Oh, so this was the variable practice group. This was, okay. So this group, they practice right at the free throw line. This group, they practice shots from in front of and behind the free throw line. This group practice shots in front, on, and in behind the free throw line. And then this group just did at the free throw line and behind. And so what it shows is that the percent improvement from learning led to the best on a retention test when they did the variable practice. So they had 4 different options. This one was the most variable, and it led to, doing shots from different areas, but it led to the most improvement following a retention test. So if you were to probably look at the scores of how the people did during practice, who of the groups do you think did the worst? Who do you guys think? Yeah. So free throw only did the worst. Most variable did the best, right? So this is just a classic study that shows just proves variability is important. But do you remember what, who was it? Who said that? You got to be careful. Rose Ryan, right? You got to be careful of the current skill level of the people that you're teaching because you want to introduce too much variability or else it's too hard. So you just got to make sure that you understand, and hopefully through this lecture, you get a better idea, but you have to understand your audience and sort of work with that as well. So then how should you vary your practice regime given the motor skill that you're looking at? And so it's going to be specific to the skill that you're trying to teach. Oh, Paul has a question. Does knowing more variation reduce choking in games? Probably. So choking depends on sort of whether the person internalizes, but maybe that's related to confidence. So maybe by showing variation, you're giving them confidence that they can sort of do all variations of the movement. So I'm trying to be general because it's very specific. Like what we're going to alter and sort of the factors are going to be very specific to whatever skill we're trying to teach. But I'm trying to be general with the lecture, if that makes sense. Okay, Apollo knows. So, so the question is to you. So what kind of things do you vary then, right? And so when you are think of the skill that we are trying to teach for closed skills. For closed skills, typically, there is no change there is no change in regulatory conditions. So what you change is the non-regulatory conditions. For closed skills with intertrial variability, something like like golf, you want to change regulatory and non-regulatory conditions. And then for open skills, you want to definitely change regulatory and non-regulatory conditions. So you either the conditions are what you're going to change, and then depending on the skill that you're trying to teach, you can alter different things. So here, let's just give it an example. So what about learning how to throw a dart, right? So trying to teach people how to throw darts. Now, in the free throw, technically that is a closed skill, so you may not want to change regulatory conditions. However, in that skill, you were initially trying to teach someone how to throw. That's why they introduced practice variability with the regulatory conditions. Technically, if you didn't know how to throw a dart, you could just get them used to a warm up, stand a couple feet ahead, get used to throwing the dart. But if you're teaching them how to be a good dart player, you're not going to, because in darts, you're always from the same line. So you're not going to change that kind of stuff. So the regulatory conditions in practice won't change. So you don't need to vary. So the regulatory conditions in real life don't change. So you don't need to vary it. What you would vary then, so the regulatory conditions within like board height, distance to the throw line, dart characteristics, you don't want to modify any of that. What you do want to modify is the non-regulatory conditions. So the number of throws that they take in a row, score of the game or game situation. So what they're aiming at. So I'm not a crazy dart player, unless when I'm drinking. But I'm assuming you aim for the different numbers based on the situation. Like I play around the world, so you just aim for 1, 2, 3, 4, and just keep going. But that's not tournament darts. I don't know if anyone's a dart player. So you can add in spectators to get them used to like anxiety levels. You can change lighting. So non-regulatory conditions. So now let's talk about a fairway shot in golf. So that would be a closed motor skill, but with intertrial variability. So in this case, you would change regulatory conditions. So if you want to teach someone how to do fairway shots, you're going to introduce variability in practice. You're going to change the distance to the hole and therefore the club that they need, the type of lie, whether it's a hill or flat, the width of the fairway, the course itself. So these are the kind of things that you want to introduce for these examples in terms of variability to optimize learning. Any questions about that, guys? And then I just came up with, I found these two practice regimes that introduce variability in golf and high jump. Any questions, anyone? So if we know that practice variability leads to improved learning, and we can all sort of agree on that, then what is the best way to organize variability then within the practice? And so this relates to the learning phenomenon that has been developed called the contextual interference effect. So what that means is that you want to add in some interference cognitively because it allows for improved processing. And so we're going to talk about this specifically for the next couple slides. So the contextual interference term is described as the memory and performance disruption that results from performing variations of a skill within the context of practice. Okay, so think about if you are doing, here, Vic, tell me, a random skill that you're going to teach. Make it simple. Sure, dribbling a soccer ball. Okay. So, trying to think about how they would practice that, but they got to learn how to dribble. I mean, stationary, and then dribble while like running. Give me like variations. Sure, right? So while running, standing still, and maybe with like turning around or something, right? Now, I need them to get from. Okay, that's an even better idea, right? They need to go forward and backward and then sideways while dribbling. Get used to that, right? So is it better to have them practice going forward 10 times, then go backward 10 times, and then sideways 10 times? Or is it better to go like forward, backward, backward, forward, sideways, sideways, like random variations? Which do you think would lead to better learning? Yes, and the reason why the variations lead to improved learning, and that's the variations is called like increasing contextual interference, right? The amount of variability in practice means the amount of contextual interference is because when you're doing the same skill over and over again without a variation, you're not like like you have to take the information from your long-term memory, you have to reconsolidate it, add it to your working memory, right? The motor program, like whatever the environment is, and then output it. If you're repeating the same trial without any variations, you're not like working your brain to have to pull that information out. It's already been processed. So you're not reprocessing it. And that's what leads to better learning is that whole idea of bringing it back out from the brain out to the body. Does that make sense, everyone? Right? Because we don't forget stuff. Forgetting isn't a problem with the information being gone. It's a problem with getting the information out. Like putting it all back together. The idea of putting it all back together. That's how our brain works, right? It has all this information that it just stores in different compartments. We got to pull it all together and then put it into something that we can add to the motor program. So we're going to talk about different types of practice schedules, but when we relate to like the amount of contextual interference, we're talking about the amount of variability or random variations in a practice setting. So you can rate, a practice as having a high or low level of contextual interference based on how random it is. Okay? Now, there's going to be situations like a low skill level where you can't just start off with high variability. So this isn't, yes, high variability or high contextual interference is important, but like we want to make sure that we understand that we build up to that. So here's an example of 3 different types of practice settings. Okay, so in this example, we're teaching someone how to throw a baseball. So we're gonna have them practice variations of how to throw the baseball by throwing overhand, underhand, and sidearm. Okay. So we're having 3 movement variations, and therefore there would be suggesting 3 different ways to organize our practice. Block practice is when we have no variability. Random practice is when we have lots of variability randomly, and then serial is sort of like in between. Okay, we have 6 days, and each class is 30 minutes. So we have 6 days and 30 minutes each day to teach people how to do baseball throws. So in block practice, where we have low contextual interference, they're going to practice for 1 day all overhand. So they're going to practice all overhand for 2 days, all underhand for 2 days for the whole practice session, and then all sidearm for the last 2 days. So there's no variability. Look at the random practice. What they do is they blocked off the 30 minutes into 6 different sections, and they're practicing in a random order. Whereas serial practice is sort of in between, where they have broken down the class into 6 different sections, and they're doing the order in which like they're practicing the variations of movement is the same each day. So can we see the, of the 3, which one has the lowest contextual interference? And then which one would have the highest? Perfect. Yep. Cool. And so hopefully you can see, can you guys see? Hopefully you can see from this slide that by having a random, so now they have to like reprocess, the throw. They have to get it like each time now they have to get it out of their head and put it like recreate the motor program from memory because it's always random. That leads to worse performance, more performance error during practice. But because of the whole cognitive component with the initial stages of learning, it leads to better performance in real life. I have a really good video showing that. It's like 50 minutes long. Cool. So have you guys ever heard? Yeah, have you guys ever heard of the term like, oh, that guy's a good practice player? Oh, that player's just good in practice. It's probably because they're good, right? They're good at the skills in practice, and so they're not actively thinking anymore. So they can't take them to the next level. So they're not introducing variability. So in a real life game situation, when it's a little bit different than it is in practice, because they're not used to reconsolidating all that information from memory, they're not as good in terms of their performance in a real life situation. Here we have a study that was looking at the differences between blocked and random practice. And for this, it was teaching people how to do badminton serves. And so they would do badminton shots. So by introducing variability from short, long, and drive serves, all from the right side. And then the retention test. So after a couple of days, they would come back and practice serving from the left side. So it's like a transfer test because it is the same skill, but you've changed the environment because now they're shooting from the opposite side of, or the opposite side of the badminton court. So what they did was they had people practicing either a block schedule or a random schedule, and ultimately what showed that following a retention test, the random practice did significantly better versus the block practice. But what do we see? Block practice, for the most part, was better during practice. And then on the retention test, we see that random practice individuals performed um, significantly better. Everyone get that? So ultimately, I think that these like sort of like this terminology and stuff is easy to understand. I think the difficulty in it, like in real life, is you need to figure out how to introduce variability and like at what like degree, like how quickly do you introduce variability and what kind of variations for the skill that you're specifically trying to teach, right? So you have to evaluate like the skill level of the learners, and you know what level are they at, how much time you have. That's the concepts is easy. It's about the application of it that's just going to take experience and practice. Ryuta, why wouldn't it be better to combine both blocked and random variations for beginners? And that's exactly it. Is that it is. So if we have people that are really beginners, they first need to like just sort of get an idea of the movement pattern, and that's why we're going to suggest that actually going from a level for beginners, you start off with some low contextual interference, and then like progress your way up. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Cool. So why do you think that there's two like so these are two issues related to block practice schedules, and so they're trying to think of like why would blocked practice schedules lead to poorer learning? It may lead to the fact that because they're, again, when we were saying they're not reproducing the motor program, they're not seeing as much errors during practice. It makes the learner think they know better than they do or have learned better than they do, so they stop trying. Their self judgment about how good they're doing is, yeah, where is Drew? Hmm. Yo, that's okay. Put us on in the background. Where does he work? Okay. He must be really busy with 10 people an hour. So poor Drew. Okay, well, shout out to Drew. Professional. Okay. So can you guys understand that by a block practice schedule, if the person is doing really well, they're overestimating how much they've learned. So they stop, like, they think they know more than they do. So they're just like not as engaged as they would be if, you know, they're seeing a little bit more error. Does that make sense, everyone? Cool. So with what Ryuta was saying, we're talking about the limits of contextual interference. You're exactly right, right? So we know that high contextual interference is important, but we also want to consider the sort of environment or the audience that we're teaching to, and that they may be beginners, and that you may want to have like a development of a grading, a bit of low, start off with low contextual interference, and then sort of increase the variability to get to high contextual interference, right? Um, the limits that have been suggested in research of the contextual interference effect is when talking about certain skills that are very, very complex, it may be too difficult to just jump right into um, high variability. You want to just have the people foster a movement pattern and then introduce variability more slowly. And that right here, when we have, so this is more a factor of the skill itself. If the skill itself is very complex, you want to start with low interference or low contextual interference. If the audience, if the people learning are beginners, you may also want to start off with block practice, and then progress to random practice. And so here we have those rules just listed out right here. And that's called the challenge point hypothesis. So yes, high contextual interference is important, but based on the skill or the learners, you may need to alter and have a grading, a graded increase in variability. Now, other research has looked into why or wanting to describe why the whole contextual interference effect occurs, and we've discussed this on the previous slides, and I've been talking about it a lot. And there are two components. It's called the elaboration hypothesis. So it suggests by introducing more variations, you are um, you are basically giving the learner the experience of performing that skill under different conditions. So that's improving the amount that's being remembered. All the different variations are being remembered. So it leads to a much larger sort of, memory consolidation. And then the action plan reconstruction hypothesis is what I was talking about when we don't actually forget stuff. It's trying to get information out. So by having high contextual interference, it's having them to, because it's random, they have to recreate, take everything out of the memory, recreate the motor program for that situation. And it's improving that whole reconstruction process, which is, think about this, right? So when you're studying, you don't always study just the lecture slides and then you only ask yourself questions in order of the lecture. So when you guys are studying for this exam, you're gonna go lecture 1, 2, 3, all the way to 10, and then just keep going 1 to 10, 1 to 10, 1 to 10. No, what you want to do is you want to like challenge yourself. Do lecture 1, then try to lecture 9, then go 4, right? Once you've right, you may want to start 1 to 9, 1 to 10 to start off with, get an idea, then go lectures, review lectures in different order, ask yourself questions during that time, and then ask yourself random questions from any lecture. Oh, that's a good example. Does that make sense, everyone? So it's, both theories are probably correct. Like there's not just one. But these characteristics have been observed when they were doing this research, that when you have more variability, because the people are always thinking, they're more attentive to what they're doing. So that's right. When people are more attentive to the skill that they're learning, they're going to learn better. And then, like we talked about earlier, people in block practice schedule tend to overestimate how they're doing, and so they stop thinking as much as they should. Cool. Now, I added this slide last semester because someone asked a question. I just wanted to reiterate it. So we had talked about this whole term of practice specificity. So that term practice specificity, does anyone remember what it meant? And is it at odds with practice variability? I said in lecture 7, it might have been last week, that you want to make sure that the sensory processes that are available in practice are going to be the ones that are going to be available in a real life situation, because if certain augmented feedback is provided during practice, humans will get dependent on it. Remember? So when we're talking about practice specificity, we're talking about the specifics of the feedback that's available when we're performing the skill during practice. So that's not talking about variability or variations of movement. We just want to make sure that, if I'm trying to teach someone how to ride a bike, and I just keep the training wheels on, right? Practice, practice, practice with the training wheels on. And then the next time they show up for the test, I take the training wheels off and say, go. They're not gonna have been familiar without, they're gonna have been dependent on the training wheels for the bicycle, correct? So when we're talking about practice specificity, we're talking about the sources of feedback that are available, the environmental conditions that are available, and sort of like, the cognitive type of sort of decision making that is appropriate. You don't want to change any of that stuff. So we're not talking about changing things in the environment that they'll see in real life. We're talking about making sure that people don't become dependent on the stuff that's available in practice. Does that make sense, everyone? Yeah. Because when we're talking about practice variability, we're talking about variations of movement. We want to introduce error because error leads to the person thinking about it and more of a problem-solving capability, which ultimately leads to better memory representation and better learning and therefore better performance. Almost done. You guys good? Okay. So then the next question is, we understand now we want to consider our audience, but have variability in our practices to lead to better learning. Now, how much practice is important? Well, research has looked at the amount of practice necessary, right? We've looked at the amount of practice and the spacing distribution, like the spacing between practice sessions that would lead to a more optimal learning situation. And so the questions that I want to ask you guys are, well, how much practice should a person engage in? Is more practice actually better? Because research has shown, interestingly, that this is not always the case, right? Things to consider when we're talking about how much practice is necessary: the amount of time to practice with each activity, the length of sessions, and then the rest in between sessions. So let's go through this topic. So the first sort of research that sort of looked at this, where they were looking at like it was basic training in the military, and they decided that they were having a problem with people forgetting how to like I think they were like putting together their gun. They were forgetting their basic training skills when they were finished basic training. They would get called back to the military base after a certain amount of time. They found that they would have forgot their gun putting together skills. And so what they decided was that they were just going to increase the amount of training that they had for that skill in basic training. They were just going to train them more. And they call that process overlearning. So it's the continuation of practice beyond the amount needed to achieve a certain performance criterion. So think about if we were talking about those free throws from the example at the beginning of the lecture. The sort of goal would be to get 10 in a row. Once you get 10 in a row, I feel we've decided as a group, all of us, we're doing research, that they have now learned the skill. Right? So then on a retention test, we would see how well they've sort of learned. Overlearning is adding more practice past the point where we've decided that they've learned the skill well enough. Is there a benefit of that? That whole process is called overlearning. And like I said, this came out of the US Army that decided that what they were going to do was they were going to increase the amount of time or training for the like gun putting together skill, because they found that procedural skills, those skills like a series of discrete movements where they put it all together, that they were the most easily forgotten. So what they did was, I guess initially they decided that, it would take a certain amount of like trials before people would get up to a certain amount, like a certain level of ability. They decided they were going to add more trials. So they just decided that they were going to add in whatever time was they had set out for gun cleaning, putting together. They were going to add it another 100% of practice sessions. And ultimately what it did was it led to people that were coming back from basic training back into the military. They had learned it better. So this got people thinking, well, okay, what about this idea of overlearning? What are the factors to consider behind that? Here we had a research that was done like semi-recently, but this was about 15 years ago. And what they did was, this is called a dynamic, it's called a stabilimeter. So they have to keep their weight equally on each side so that they can practice their balance. Now, what this study showed was that there was a certain amount. So what they would do is they would have people practice up to a point where they would have, a certain ability that we've decided as the ability. And then what they would do is they would give those people either 50% practice, 100% extra practice, or 200% extra practice. And then what this study showed was that by giving someone 50% extra practice versus 100% extra practice, it led to the same. It also showed that people that did the 200% amount of practice actually did worse than the people that only practice at 50%. So they showed this whole idea of diminishing returns. Okay. Um, this study, what they found was that that overlearning. So what they would do is they would have a group that would practice like past their practice schedule, and they would have the students determine. So this is for like a physical education class setting. They found that for like open skills, because it's football, they would have the students select what they wanted to practice, because if they got to select themselves, they'd be more engaged in it. So this generally showed that overlearning led to better like learning and ultimately better improvement, but there is a limit. That first study showed this whole idea of diminishing returns. That has been repeated for different trials. There's the general rule is 50% of extra practice is the upper limit. Anything past than that, you're risking this whole idea of diminishing returns or learning deficits. So why do you think that we would see this whole idea of diminishing returns with too much learning? Here we have another study. And so what they had people do was they had people practice. So this was a study where they had to move a stylus horizontal distance without vision. Okay, so they practiced 42 trials, 77, 102, 127, and 152. Okay, so there's 5 different groups, and this was how they performed during practice, and then this is how they performed on a transfer test. So we can see that. So the original group was this is 100%. This would be 150, and they just increased it up. Can you see how we had by increasing practice from 42? They learned better. And then see how we had this idea of diminishing returns. The people that did extra than 50% practice trials actually learned worse. Interesting, right? So give me an idea of why we see this concept of diminishing returns with too much practice. Yeah, it's this whole idea of fatigue, that if the person becomes too good at it, either they're tired and they're not thinking about it, or they're overestimating that they know it too well and then they stop thinking about it. But once you stop thinking about it, you're just like going on sort of like on rhythm, or you're going on memory. Like you're just going on sort of like on repeat. And so you can develop bad habits. Exactly. That's true, right? Take breaks so that way we can get people to stop fatiguing, and that they can like take a break, and then so they can be cognitively evaluated, or cognitively into what they're doing. So this whole idea with overlearning suggests that if you have too much learning, you're just like introducing fatigue because they get bored about what they're doing. Right? So here we go. The 2 reasons why we see this whole idea of diminishing returns with too much overlearning is that the extended practice of relatively simple tasks can have the learners not engage in the appropriate amounts of cognitive effort that's required to improve performance and learn. And by having people practice the same variations over and over and over again, that they're not recalling it out of their memory, and so they are not thinking about it, and they may be developing bad habits. So does that make sense, everyone? Okay. So the military guys, when they first developed basic training, they said, I don't know what the time was or whatever. They said they would do like 3 hours, 3 hours a week for the 8 weeks of cleaning and putting your gun together. And then what they would do is, so you go to basic training and then you go home and then you get called back into base when like you're needed, right? The guys getting called back, even though they did it in basic training, they forgot. So what they did was like, well, instead of 3 hours, we'll just add in 6 hours. And they found that by adding in 3 extra hours, or 100% more, that's hypothetical, but 100% more time to gun cleaning and putting together, they learned it better because when they came back from basic training, back to the army when there was a war, they didn't forget. So that was the first people that said, "Oh, you just got to overlearn them." So then these studies were like, well, is there a limit to how much you can like what if you made them like do like 1 billion hours? There's a limit, 50%. So if whatever the amount was required to get them to the certain level that you've decided that they've learned, you make them practice for 50% more. So you want to practice dart throwing. They finally get to a point where they're good. Whatever they get 3 bullseyes in a row, or whatever you say is, the outcome that is required to say that they are good. You would say, let's say it took them 100 practice shots, and generally everyone gets to that level at about 100 practice shots. Then what you do is you make it do a 150. If you did 200, it's too much. 50% overlearning, general rule. Cool, right? Yeah. So okay, so it's gonna be dependent on like the skill that like how do you do 50% more learning with stroke rehab? Like it's gonna be like I'm just giving you guys hopefully some solid basis and sort of clarification or not like proof of like these concepts in terms of motor learning. And then what we need to do is like you guys as the kids or wherever you end up in your career and me, like we're taking these concepts and the real life situation is just trying to apply them to the skill or to the environment or the population that we're trying to teach in that setting or in that circumstance. Man free. Yeah, exactly, right? And so the idea with Kobe is that he went crazy, but sorry, that sounds he went off with the amount of he was always practicing. But what made him great was that he was always thinking about it, right? Remember like he had such a good understanding of the game. Remember his like little like vignettes that he would do? I forget what it was called. Drive or Insight or you remember those videos he would do? He would practice so much, but he would be mentally in it. And the problem with most people is that if you're forcing them to practice, they're out. They're not thinking about it as much, right? So now what about, okay, so if we now know that practice variability is good, that we want to understand that you can have overlearning, what's the best way to distribute our practice schedules? So we want to consider the length and frequency of practice sessions and the like sort of like the amount of rest in between each practice sessions. What are some of the conditions that we need to understand? So there's 2 main types of practice schedules. You know how you can do like, you can do your course like once a week for 12 weeks, or you can do like 5 days, 8 hours a day and just pump it out. Which one's better for learning? Massed practice is when we have longer and fewer sessions where the time in between trials is very short, or we can have distributed practice where we have shorter and a greater number of sessions where the amount of time in between sessions is longer. Which one do you guys think leads to better learning, mass practice or distributed practice? Yep, exactly. So you guys are guessing right. Now, of course, I mean, it is like time for like for lots of different reasons. There's situations where we have mass practice, right, for crash courses and certain things. But research has shown that distributed practice does lead to better learning. So, like for example, do you think it's better for courses? I like think about like so. Let's say you do 5 courses a semester. Would it be better to do all 5 courses at once a week each, or one course and finish it every 2 weeks? It'd probably, I don't know, it'd probably be easier to do mass practice and have one course at a time, but doing distributed or multiple at once would actually probably lead to better learning, right? So here's an example of a study that looked at distributed versus mass practice. So do you remember the dynamic balance thing? Like the the stability meter. So this was one study. They used that. They had the equipment there. So like, okay, let's do this study to see the difference between distributed or mass practice. So what they did was they did where they had people do the same amount of practice over like one day or 2 half days, and they found that the people that did the 2 day or the distributed practice led to a improved learning. Right. So this is error. So they had less error. Over the 3 practice sessions. I'm just waiting for any questions, but no. Here we have another one. So this was golf putting. So they compared 2 different groups. So what they did was that they defined a practice session as, or like the amount of practice that each person was going to get as 240 practice shots. Okay, and then they would look at their putting scores. So they divided 2 groups where both groups had to do 240 practices, but the mass group did 1 day of 240 practice hits, whereas the distributed group did 4 days, where each day they only did 60 hits. And what you can see is that, look right here, putting score, that with the distributed practice, they led to improved score. So golf's lower score is better. See how they did better? So why do you guys think that is? Why do you guys think that? I've presented like 2 studies, but there were like, if you guys have the textbook, they just went off. Like they go on and on and on and on just to prove that distributed practice is better than mass practice. Why? And there's probably lots of reasons, but give me some reasons as to why you think that that is the case, which is exactly the same reasons as things we've talked about this lecture and previous lectures. Yeah, people get fatigued or bored. They just stop thinking, right? Like think about when I'm doing my continuing education courses. Like if it's like a full day, by hour 2, I'm done. Like I'm not thinking anymore, right? Yeah, exactly. Because we get in, we all have a certain amount of attention. Unless you're super interested in it, it's hard to like stay focused. So with mass practice, initially they're probably thinking, but then we have we have all that time where people aren't cognitively engaging in what they're doing, and so they're not learning. I do not. Yeah. Although patient brought me like 100 different like chocolates today, so I'm good. So here we have the 3 possible reasons as to why distributed practices is better than mass practices. So we've talked about it, the fatigue hypothesis. They're fatigued, so they're not having the attention on what they're doing. The cognitive effort, they're not paying attention, and therefore there's a reduced amount of cognitive effort into understanding what they're doing. And then with mass practice, remember how it's drawing, it's not forgetting, it's drawing it out from the brain. That is the like sort of what's required in appropriate learning. That by doing mass practice and not having space between sessions, that you're sort of like you're not optimizing that whole practicing of getting the information out of long-term memory. By having more days, it has time for it to sit, and then you're practicing the having to get it out of your memory skill. Is that okay, guys? I'm not going too fast. Do you guys see the YouTube channel that I post all this stuff on? If you can go back and see, so this lecture last year was like the pandemic. We were all like, I don't know what's going on. I looked at it today just because I thought it was funny. But you can go back and just and sort of like see my commentary, as we all did not know what the heck was going on. Okay. So last thing. So who talked about breaks? Someone did. Brandon? No. Someone said breaks are good. Marco. So Marco said breaks are good, right? So on your thought, Marco, we've talked about variability. We've talked about that's important. Understand your audience and the skill and say that maybe it's better to do low contextual interference first, then high contextual interference, right? And you can do that by having random practice versus blocked practice. We want to do distributed practice when we can because it allows for better learning versus mass practice. Now, what about the time in between trials? How many breaks should people get while they're practicing? And so this is real quick, but the time in between repetitions is going to be based on whether or not the skill is continuous or discrete. If it's a very long skill, you may want to you want to like wait a longer amount of time. This is very arbitrary, but if it's a continuous skill that takes a long time, you can wait longer in between sessions. Whereas if it's a discrete motor skill that takes a short amount of time, like darts, for example, a very quick skill, you don't have to wait as long when you are waiting to start the next trial. Does that make sense, everyone? So when we're talking about distributed versus mass schedules, I'm not talking about like the days. I'm talking about how long to wait in between practice, like practice trials. So the intertrial variable or the most optimal intertrial interval is going to be dependent on the type of skill. If it's a continuous skill that takes longer, you can make it more distributed, or therefore you can have a bigger break in between trials on the same day. Or if it's a discrete skill, you want to wait less time in between trials. So does that make sense, everyone? Marco, you good? Anyone? Did I freeze? Oh, whoops. I fucked up. There you go. All good. Yeah, let me show you. I'm gonna. Is everyone good? I'm gonna stop presenting so that I can just talk to you guys. Stop. You're presenting. Stop presenting. I'm going to just turn off the presentation so that way we can all just talk. Or I'm gonna stop recording. Ready? Good. Okay.